Welcome to At Center Stage at the NAFEM show. I'm Allison Godlove. Joining me now for 2023 and beyond, a view from The Economist, is Connor Lokar. He's with ITR, the New Hampshire-based research and forecasting firm. As a senior forecaster, he has a keen understanding of how forecasts are derived. Connor, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thrilled to be here at Center Stage, my first year at the NAFEM big show. I know it's been a long time since this group's gotten together, and I'm really happy to be here and be a part of it.
Yeah, wonderful to have you. How does it feel? How's the energy so far?
It's awesome. I mean, this show, everyone I've talked to, it's, tons of energy, and it's huge. I did not realize how big it was.
It's a really big show when you walk into the building. So obviously you've given us ITR's forecast and subsequent revisions in the past. So now that we are in it, do you see any changes for 2023?
We do. We made an official forecast change to our outlook for the U.S. economy actually in December. So a fresh change in our book. As recently as the start of the fourth quarter last year, we were team soft landing at ITR. We thought that the economy was going to slow in 2023, bend but not break, if you will, and then things would get better in 2024. And unfortunately, we no longer have that opinion.
Okay.
The reason for that primarily is the Federal Reserve. Big meeting today, and folks paying attention know that the Fed has really been pouring it on as far as interest rate increases are concerned. And why do we care about that? Why do we care about interest rates going higher? And essentially it's just they're dampening to economic activity. And we've been watching the bond market. We were watching it very closely throughout 2022. And our concern primarily is something that folks probably hear a lot about in the headlines, which is yield curve inversion, which I don't have to get in the weeds on that here this morning, but we hit that trigger. What we care about is the 90-day to 10-year Treasury yield comparison. Basically what happens is your shorter term yields go above that 10-year, and it's basically a bond market signal that the Fed has gone too far, which is typically what they do. It is basically never happened that the Fed Goldilocks it and they get it just right on interest rates, just enough to slow the economy down, just enough to get inflation where they want it. Typically they overshoot, and we feel that they did that officially, and basically started to see that signal in October of last year. It became statistically relevant for us by December, and as we looked at that, we are now forecasting actually a recession for the U.S. economy this cycle. Now, where I think we're different, and maybe different from what a lot of folks have been reading, is I think the headline environment is more or less arrived at the matter of, it's a matter of when, not necessarily if we go into recession. ITR differs that we don't think it's right away. We don't think that we're there right now. We don't think that we're going to be there tomorrow. We actually think it starts at the end of this year and actually really characterizes 2024. We think that 3 years from now, as folks look back, they'll look at 2023 as an okay year, not a fantastic year, but an okay year, and actually 24 as the worst year. Because reality is interest rate increases, it takes time to take a chunk out of the economy. Every market behaves very differently. Housing has been in recession, single family housing, probably a lot of homeowners here. That market's been in recession since June of last year, which folks I think are starting to realize now, but it's been there for almost 3 quarters at this point. And that's because housing, as everyone knows, it's rate dependent, it's mortgage rate sensitive, it is very consumer dependent. So the Fed kind of has a check sheet they're going down on portions of the economy that they want to beat up, and housing's at the top of the list. So they got housing, and now they're coming for everything else basically at this point. The general retail environment, whether it's eating at home, eating out, eventually they'll get to durable goods, which of course a lot of the manufacturers here care about, and so on and so forth. So we think that pain takes time to really filter throughout the entirety of the economy. So we think it actually starts at the end of this year and carries well into 2024. Now, it's a mild recession that we're forecasting. We're not forecasting 08, 09 again. We're not forecasting COVID again, whether it's for food service or otherwise, but something that would be more historically comparable to, say, the early 2000s or the early 1990s for any folks that remember that in the audience. So we think it's survivable, but more painful than we think we were otherwise going to see had the Fed not overstepped, in our opinion, as far as over-tightening. So it's recession 2024 and kind of a slow bleed on the growth side throughout the balance of this year on the way there.
So then do you think inflation is leveling?
It depends, I think, quite a bit on perspective and definition. The federal government's trying to sell the narrative right now that inflation is fixed, but it's really not that simple. The inflation rate is coming down, but that's not prices coming down. This has really been grinding our gears at ITR for the last several months, really, is, right now the monthly CPI number is at 6.5%, which means, your cost of living at home has gone up by 6.5 points. Looked at another way, if you've gotten a raise of 6.4% or less in the last 12 months, you are moving backwards. You are moving backwards in your standard of living. And all of a sudden now we're celebrating a 6.5% inflation data point because it was 9.1% in July of last year at the top. And that's a little akin to me of it's like celebrating your fever dropping from 109.1 to 106.5. It's
Yeah.
like, we're still dead at this temperature. This is not, 6.5% 24 months ago, that's a jump out the window type number. But all of a sudden, comparatively, we feel good about it because it's down 2.5% from where it was 2 quarters ago. So inflation's not fixed. Inflation's getting better statistically. What that means is that everything in your lives is getting more expensive less quickly. So, when the headline, someone might say, oh, inflation's coming down, and they might think to themselves, okay, prices are coming down. My F-150 is going to cost less. My, commercial kitchen equipment's going to cost less. And no, that's not really what's happening here. And, any purchaser of groceries knows that prices are not going down anywhere. Food inflation is almost double the aggregate inflation rate. It's running north of 11% right now. And I think that that's really the trickiest components, whether it's, inputs if I'm running a restaurant or I'm just a normal person, buying groceries. The Fed can beat up housing. They can make you not want to buy a house because the rate went up too much. Transitively, they can make you not want to buy a washing machine or a car, whether it's because of financing or general sentiment. But people have to eat, whether they're eating out or eating at home. The Fed can't fix that. They can't snap their fingers and increase global wheat supply by 15%. They can't snap their fingers and make fertilizer input costs drop, which have gone up minimum 150%, if not more, for farmers over the last couple of years. So they can't fix that one. They can smack around metals. They can smack around energy to a mild extent. But food's a problem for them, and it's going to be a problem. We think that that's really the stickiest component of inflation this year. So I would temper expectations along those lines where, inflation rate decline is not pricing decline. It will get easier to manage for businesses in the room. It will get easier to manage from a household budget standpoint. But if we're waiting for whether it's a large piece of kitchen equipment or, my just receipt at the grocery store to roll back the clock 3 years and say, oh, I'm going to pay what I did in 2019. That's not, you're going to turn to dust while you wait for that to happen because it's not going to happen as we look forward. So ultimately, we think inflation gets to that sub 2% target that the Fed, kind of speaks to next year. We think that CPI continues to drop this year, falls into the 2 to 3% range for 2023, and gets below 2% in 2024 because of the recession. And because that's the end game for the Fed, is that they have to damage demand sufficiently to get inflation where they want it. The Fed's going to get killed for whatever they do here. They're already getting killed for what they do here, but they're left with 2 very unappealing paths in the road. It's we turn left and we don't tighten enough. Not tightening enough would feel better in the short term. We don't get the recession. We get the soft landing that we previously thought we were going to have. But inflation bottoms out at about 3% and it's back to 5 to 6% in 2024. Or they turn right, which is the path they've taken, and they tighten what generally will be perceived as too much. But they get the recession and they get inflation below 2%. And you could make an argument that that's, ripping the Band-Aid now is maybe preferable because long-term systemic high single-digit inflation is not sustainable. It is not sustainable nationally. It is not sustainable from an individual perspective. So, if I were to armchair quarterback the Fed and how they've handled inflation, I would kill them for what they did in 2021, which was nothing. They watched gleefully as the inflation freight train left the station starting in the spring of 2021 and ignored it. At first they tried to say it was, all in your mind. They tried to explain it away in the summer of 2021. And then I think it was July or August of 2021, they tried to say, actually, this is a good thing because it's getting up our long-term averages. And I'm apparently that didn't poll well because that didn't last more than about a month. And then they finally realized that they blew it. So I begrudge them less for what they're doing now. I begrudge them more for what they did not do in 2021, that has essentially forced their hand into where they are now, because our opinion at ITR was that sub 2% inflation and soft landing for the economy essentially became mutually exclusive outcomes last year, particularly after Russia invaded Ukraine, which added a ton of inflation, energy into the global economy for metals, fertilizer, fuels, food, food commodities. So any chance of that Goldilocks scenario, like that train left the station almost a year ago at this point. So now they're left with a couple of unappealing options, really.
So we are seeing that from 2021, and we're moving forward and taking a look at 2024 being the worst of it. So are we expecting then the recession to go deeper than what we're looking at right now?
We still think it's mild. There's some variables. So really big Fed meeting today where they're presumably going to increase interest rates again, at least 25 basis points. I think there's a non-zero chance that they even go 50, because the Fed has a problem right now. They can't fix inflation until, it's kind of a ghoulish way to look at it, until these folks or we lose our jobs. Normal people, not them. Their jobs are too important, of course, but that's what they're trying to engineer. They need hundreds of thousands of Americans to lose their jobs to bring demand down to fix inflation. And the job openings number came out this morning. It increased in December. They are, even with all the layoff headlines that you've read, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Amazon, or Meta, whatever they're calling themselves now, Amazon, Salesforce, 3M, it's not enough. They need more. And so the Fed generally gets what they want. And it's pretty clear what they want at this point, which is employment decreases, unemployment increases, and total purchasing power coming down. So as it stands, we think 2024 will be a mild recession, again, starting at the end of this year. But they could make it worse. We're basically baking in, quote unquote, another 50 basis points between now and March, that they're going to go again, probably 25 today, again 25 in March, and then by the time we're into the second quarter, they're pulling the plug and probably realizing that they've gone too far. But as it stands now, even if they shocked the world and came out with 0 today, which they're not gonna, but even if they did, we think it's immaterial in terms of recession probability at this point. We feel that the die has been cast, the dominoes have been tipped, and a recession is coming. And really, it's more, I don't think they can save it at this point. To your question, they can only make it worse.
Yeah.
So that's more of our priority. We spent last year playing the will it or won't it be a recession game. Now we are in the will it be mild or will it not. We think that we're officially heading in that direction regardless of what they do next.
Let's talk about supply issues and some challenges. We've talked about this in the past before, but do you see this improving?
We do. We do see that. I think that the silver linings I can lend to this recession is that it's going to fix or at least improve the primary external items that has made everyone at this show's life exceptionally difficult over the last 2 years. And everyone has their own, rankings of the pain points, but it's been the big three. It's been labor, inflation, and supply chain. Particularly supply chain for this group, and that is getting better. Folks I talk to, I don't want to say it's fixed because it's not even close, but most of my clients, most of the audiences I talk to were arriving at some relative stability. It's not that supply chain's good, it's that it's not noticeably worse than it was 6 months ago. And that's how it has to start. It has to stop getting worse before it can get better.
Right.
And so we're seeing it starting to incrementally improve. A lot of my clients are saying, yeah, lead times are stabilizing, even creeping down. Still paying through the nose for whatever I want, but it's actually there. And my suppliers or my manufacturing partners are, they're actually delivering on their lead times, and in some cases beating expectations. So that's what it's going to look like this year. The great supply chain narrative that's been pounded into our skull over the last 2+ years is slowly fading to the background. I don't know if that'll mean that we stop hearing about it, but statistically there's a data point that we look at called the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index, which is basically a quantified data point of how good or bad are supply chains. And it's saying that they're better now than they were 90 days ago, or 180 days ago, or 270 days ago. Still way, way worse than they've been basically at any point in the 21st century other than the last year or so, but getting better. and we think that that's going to continue. So
slowly starting to see this continue to improve.
Yeah, so on our website at ITR, once a month I produce something called a Trends Talk. It's like a mini podcast. It's like 4 to 7 minutes. And I just recorded one from the hotel yesterday, and it was all about freight, because that has also been part and parcel to this supply chain conversation where, it's hearing about, shipping, freighters stacked up as far as the eye can see off the West Coast ports, and lead times unimaginably long, and even once you get the containers to the ports, it takes weeks, if not months, to get them from the ports inland. But we haven't really heard a lot about that in the last couple of quarters because it's not there. If you look at freight container traffic throughput by the top 5 U.S. ports, LA, Long Beach, Georgia, Houston, and then New York, New Jersey combined, they're falling across the board by volume, which I like these days because it takes the inflation masking out of it. I mean, they're downright collapsing on West Coast ports. They're actually approaching their April 2020 lows. Now, part of that, if you want to counter that and say that's because of the labor negotiations there, I'll happily concede that. But a lot of those containers have been rerouted around LA and Long Beach to the Gulf and to the East Coast ports. And so if we were truly growing, then that would be offset with rise in those 3 ports. But those are also falling with help from all of the rerouted Western freight. It's falling across the board. And I think that that's really important for us to listen to because before the entire collapsing supply chain hyperinflation narrative came to define our lives starting in mid-2021, freight and container rates and container volume, that was the first signal of what was coming starting basically at the end of the second quarter of 2020 to the upside. And I think it will be equally as valuable to watch on the downside here. And we've seen steady atrophy there for multiple quarters at this point. It's getting worse. The retail numbers for November, December, the media told people they were disasters. They weren't disasters. They were okay. They weren't stellar by any means. But on an inflation-adjusted basis, retail in the United States went negative month over month for November and December. Retail volume from November, December 2021. So the consumer's barely keeping their head above water, and it would appear that they're starting to slip below. So it becomes lipstick on a pig at the point where that's why things are going to get better on inflation and supply chain and marginally labor. It's not because we've cracked the code. It's not like we found or increased capacity or shipping abilities by 15% overnight. It's really that the demand side of the economy, that boot is slowly lifting off the neck of the supply side of the economy. So in a vacuum, I'd be excited to see it, but it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening because there's bad things happening with the consumer at the bottom of the funnel right now.
Okay. Where do you see the labor market going?
I think, of the big 3, we are most confident in noticeable improvement in supply chain and in inflation over the next 18 to 24 months. I would say we are least confident on the labor side of things because the Fed, they can create some unemployment. They've failed to this point, but even if they do generate a mild recession, it's not going to fix what are long-term structural demographic issues for this country from a labor-based standpoint. Particularly for NAFEM members and manufacturers, right now there's 835,000 manufacturing job openings in the United States, which that's just a number. No one looks at the data all the time like I do. So for food for thought, in 2019, that number was 470,000 at its peak. Let's just hypothesize that as a byproduct of this mild recession, manufacturers start hiring less, because that'll happen. And maybe even we see a little bit of layoffs. It would take a 40% collapse in manufacturing job openings, posted openings, to bring manufacturing job labor demand to 500,000, which would still be worse than it was in 2019. And I bring that up because I do 50, 60, 70 keynotes a year. And before COVID, everyone was complaining about labor. That was the number one pain point, folks, that we talked about on the road in 2017, 18, 19. I think we forget that because it went on steroids and became so psychotically bad over the last 2 years, but it's not like we were in a great spot before COVID. So even if things collapse to a degree that we don't think they're going to, it would still leave us in a worse, or I guess more challenging place from an employer standpoint in terms of finding motivated, talented, in some cases people that just have a pulse and can pass a drug test, which is hard enough these days. things would have to get astronomically worse than we're forecasting for employers to look around in 2025 and say, yeah, I got everybody I need. I've got people lining up out the door, for my postings to come in. They're showing up for interviews. It's not going to happen. So I think the real challenge, whether I'm a manufacturer or otherwise, is going to be how do I see the forest through the trees, however that metaphor works, and not kind of get lost in this little dip and cut too much that I'm hamstringing myself for 2025 when things get better again. I should add that we do think that things rebound very nicely in 2025 after the air pocket in 2024. So if I'm overreactionary to this and I cut too much, I'm just going to have to go find those people again in a very unfriendly labor market in 2025. They'll probably be more expensive to bring back in, untrained, unonboarded, and I'm dealing with the same problems I'm dealing with right now. So I think it will be more profitable long-term for businesses to continue investing in productivity enhancing investments. Some of the booths around here are absolutely amazing, whether it's just outright displacing or at least reducing the need for human touch points, human labor. That has to be a long-term priority because we're just not going to be fixed labor-wise for a very long time, 15 to 20 years, very likely. So I would advise folks to try to look through this, and I'd rather pay too much for labor that I might be slightly underutilizing in 2024 and have them ready to go in 2025 than maybe save a short buck in 24 and then I'm not ready to rock when 2025 takes back off again. So that will be the most challenging component. Folks are going to see supply chain get better. It's already getting better. It will become much more noticeable as this year progresses. Inflation will become noticeably, and like in the real world, like as people actually feel it, better next year. Labor, I think it'll be mild. The job openings number jumped to 11 million in December. That data point came out this morning. It was projected, we don't project it, but Wall Street projection was that it was going to drop to 10.4 million. So the Fed's got a lot of work to do, and we think they will be mildly successful in some of that labor market improvement, but not substantially or sustainably, I guess I would say.
For a while, yeah. So we want to talk now a little bit about the food service specifically. So for manufacturers, what do you see as the biggest economic challenges?
Well, I think, at the end of the day, this is a very consumer-reliant group, and honestly, every group I talk to, whether they want to concede it or not, relies on the consumer, because that's how we're composed. Modernly, as a United States economy in modern times, 2/3 of GDP is consumption dependent. Really, once we take off the work uniforms and we go home, our purchasing of stuff, whether it's a car, a washing machine, a house, or a nice meal out to eat, or at a quick serve, or at a fast food restaurant, or at the grocery store, like that, all of that consumption pie is what's driving the economy. So the consumer's under duress right now. Everybody knows it, everyone feels it themselves, and there are feasible limits to how far the consumer can be pushed. And part of the reason we think recession comes next year is we think that the Fed has exceeded those limits at this point. So, if I'm a manufacturer, I'm probably taking some solace in the silver linings I just laid out, is where, okay, at least the good problems to have that I've had over the last 2 years are going to get better in terms of, okay, my ability to execute, my ability to fulfill, my ability to ship on time, or even sooner maybe than I had previously. That's all coming. And the pace at which I'm getting these insane price increases from my stainless steel suppliers or my scrap steel suppliers, metals are deflationary right now. Steel scrap's averaging down almost 30 points from where it was last year. Stainless is averaging down 35, 36 points from where it was last year. Now, I don't know if anyone's actually seen those price decreases from their suppliers, but that's what's happening at the raw material level. So the foundation is set for an easier year to manage on the input or supply side of the business, but what that'll come with is some demand uncertainty in terms of what's coming next. So, and I mentioned this earlier, people have to eat. It's really more of a question of substitution. It's how are they eating, whether as it relates to going to the supermarket or the grocery store, or am I going out to eat, or if I'm going out to eat, what am I ordering? Or if I'm going out to eat, is it full service dine-in, or is it lower cost quick serve, that kind of thing. So generally what we would expect in any recession, but particularly one characterized by pretty extreme consumer household budget stress, would be a substitution away from the industry. Basically, I can no longer justify taking my family of 4 out for $200, $300, whatever, could be less depending on where we're going, but I can't justify that anymore. And I'm going back to the supermarket. We're eating at home. And it doesn't even stop there. I work with a lot of food packaging manufacturers that, basically all the cardboard boxes you see in the grocery store. They tend to thrive in cycles like this because folks, even once they substitute out of the dine-in experience or at least decrease frequency, what they do once they get into the store also changes. Because again, if I am seeing sticker shock like I know I am in my personal life when I go, I don't do a ton of grocery shopping, but when I do, it's a little frightening these days.
Yeah.
And so what do? You substitute out high-cost proteins, high-cost produce, and you gravitate to the interior aisles, your non-perishables, your frozen foodstuffs, your boxed pastas, your high-volume, low-cost foodstuffs. So that's what we would expect. And so I would view that as the primary threat to basically everyone at this show, is that we're going to see decreasing, consumer traffic out to eat, which is going to lead to, obviously, whether we're a restaurant or a commercial outfit, obviously, pressure on the business and my ability to invest thereafter. So I lay all that out. We haven't seen it yet. That is actually not what we're seeing in the data right now. So interestingly enough, because I looked at all this data before this, whether it's full service dine-in or quick serve or fast food, they're all growing much more quickly than grocery store or supermarket retail sales, which honestly shocked me when I pulled up the data because I didn't really expect that. So it hasn't happened yet. So I'm going to try to pull the number from my brain. I believe that grocery stores, retail sales at grocery stores are up about 8.5 points. Retail sales at full service dine-in are up about 16.1%. So almost double the rate of change right now. Now it is slowing down. It's what we call phase C right now, the slowing growth phase of the business cycle. So we are seeing slower growth, whether it's purchases at the grocery store or at full service dine-in or quick serve. But as of right now, the growth rates are very favorable for non-grocery store consumption. So maybe you haven't felt it yet, if, depending on who's here, if you haven't felt it yet, the market data would say that you shouldn't be, because it looks pretty good. I actually looked at deflated grocery store retail sales, so basically pull inflation, the food inflation out of it. Grocery store retail sales, inflation adjusted, are negative right now. Americans are purchasing less food. It's off between 2 and 3% and falling rapidly. So very clearly the consumer is having problems right now. They are purchasing less, or they are purchasing cheaper items. But to this point, it has not infected the food service space. But I don't think that'll be an indefinite trend. I very much think that that's coming as this year progresses, because as we look at basically any sort of consumer income data point, they're okay at best or poor, at worst. So, if we look at savings, if we think about where we were in 2021, a lot of the demand that drove our businesses in 2022, and think about all the tailwinds we had 18 to 24 months ago. I mean, we had a stock market that was on an absolute terrible market run. We had $6 trillion of helicopter cash deployed throughout the economy in terms of direct-to-consumer stimulus. We had interest rates at zero, mortgage rates at all-time lows. We had consumer confidence at all-time highs. We also had the pent-up demand factor where folks were largely prevented from that traditional dine-in experience for quite a long time, depending on what city, state that they were in. And then the levees broke in a positive manner in terms of unleashing all of that demand potential. And now that we fast forward here to early 2023, we don't have any of those things. Savings on an inflation-adjusted basis and nominal are falling, approaching pre-COVID levels. Income levels, inclusive of government support, are back on long-term trend, massively down from where they were last year. Obviously, borrowing rates, whether it's for a mortgage or anything else, as part of the Fed discussion, are massively up. Consumer confidence and sentiment is not particularly strong right now, which, to be fair, those aren't great data points, because sometimes the consumer says they feel like junk and then they go out and spend, and then sometimes they fill it out and say they're feeling great and then they're not spending. So that one is take it or leave it there. But we just don't have what we had 18 to 24 months ago. So any sort of expectation for a market outcome in terms of the markets that we sell into to deliver the same results for 23 and 24 as we got in 21, 22, it's just not going to happen. Certainly not if we sit back and let the economy come to us. If we want to get proactive and try to, whether it's from a share gain perspective, from a marketing and selling standpoint, but if we were very much enjoying riding that rising tide line over the last 24 months, we're not going to enjoy as it recedes, and we will have to be fighting that as opposed to just being overwhelmed by the amount of business coming through our doors, whether I'm a manufacturer or an establishment operator. So there were a few other data points I looked at. So it was basically a bunch of restaurant expectation index, coincident business index, expenditure planning indexes, and those are all contracting from where they were a year prior. Now, the way that these indexes are calculated, any number above 100 would indicate a positive survey result. They're all at about 101 right now. So they're clinging to positivity and falling. So I think that that pain is coming for folks. So if you haven't felt it yet, I would expect it to come. If you are starting to feel the pressure and you've tried to explain it away and be like, well, it's kind of a soft post-Christmas time or something like that, I would caution against trying to be like, no, we'll be fine, because our big picture view is that we're not going to be, and that things are going to get harder and worse before they get better. And it's basically 6 to 7 quarters of at best slowing growth, if not contraction, coming for us.
Are those similar challenges then that we're looking at for operators?
Yeah, I think so. And
across the board.
I think particularly for operators, if I'm running, if you look at employment, if you look at total restaurant employment, it's actually not back to where it was at COVID, pre-COVID. We're still not at pre-COVID levels. It is still rising at almost a double-digit pace. It is slowing in its rate of rise, but and I don't have to sing the labor pain song to those folks, because it's been impossible for everyone. So I think that the labor commentary in terms of, yeah, our business is going to soften up, but is our demand for labor substantively going to drop off? Probably not a ton. And the cutting too deep caution, I think, rings true for those folks as well.
I know you touched on it a little bit, but maybe just a little bit more, that the biggest economic challenge is then just for consumers and what they can expect over the next 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's, the inflation story everybody knows. The stock market, we don't forecast at ITR. We're not financial advisors, but we do look at it. I think that most folks probably been underwhelmed by their 401ks or their savings accounts, however they're invested over the last couple of quarters in particular. This past month's been good, but I think the observable pain is going to show up a lot more. I think it's kind of been more behind closed doors, like, inside the household, and you're like, man, like, this is getting crazy. But I think that the headline environment is going to kind of catch up to what's actually happening here. I don't think that the stock market is done in terms of downside. It is still very overpriced. Price to earnings ratios are still very inflated. I think the market is still in absolute la-la land about it. In my opinion, Wall Street's basically pricing in the Goldilocks scenario, that if it happened to be the first time ever for the Fed, where they get inflation to below 2%, there isn't really any major earnings pain, and the economy holds up fine. And that's, again, we could be wrong, but it'd be the first time ever that the Fed actually pulls that off. So I think the market likely sees more turbulence as this year goes on. I think it's staying defensive in our investments, cyclicals that we're in. I wouldn't sell at this point. You missed our chance to bail out of your portfolio at this point. So it's more of, looking at dollar cost average opportunities and buy opportunities later this year, we think overall. But it's, you're going to keep reading headlines saying inflation's getting better, and you're not going to feel it. You're just not going to feel it till we get into next year. I think it'll be more of a statistically true statement than it will be a tangibly true statement till we get into next year. So the consumer is going to be under pressure for well into next year.
If there was an overall kind of conclusion that you could say to everything that we've talked about today and to people who came to hear you, what would you tell them?
I think that the overall conclusion, I would say I haven't had particularly great news so far, is that it's not terrible news. We are forecasting a mild recession for 2024. For the calendar year, we're projecting that GDP contracts about 0.9 points from the 2023 finish level, which, because these people don't look at these numbers, that probably means nothing, but that is statistically a very mild recession. At the bottom of the Great Recession, it was 4.5% at worst, so a quarter of that, or favorable to a quarter of that. And obviously COVID was particularly painful to certain segments of the industry, and we don't see that happening either. So it's more, I want folks to be prepared. A mild recession is survivable for 90+% of businesses. The businesses that get into trouble are the ones that are, they're over-levered, they're over-purchasing, they're over-hired. Again, I did say I don't want you firing folks, but probably backing off on new acquisition, or at least slowing down. But the businesses that get into trouble are the ones that they're straight lining their budgets and projections and purchasing accordingly up and to the right, because we just lived 2 years of up and to the right. but we're not going to have 2 years of up and to the right coming next. It's going to be sideways and mildly down. So if we plan for that, we stay insulated. I think this is an opportunity. This might actually be a breather that folks have not had for 3+ years. 2020, it was bad for its own reasons, but it was also crazy. I mean, navigating local COVID ordinances, particularly for the restaurant community. I mean, just an absolute patchwork of what we can do, what we can't do, how we do it, creating outdoor dining space and pulling it back to indoor dining space. And then we finally got that going. Then all of a sudden, next thing we knew, we're busier than we could ever imagine. We're short-staffed. We can't get folks to accommodate this business. There's a pause coming that some folks might need just for sanity's sake. And maybe we look at things that we have, probably an appropriate metaphor for the industry, that we've put on that back burner for 3 years because either we couldn't afford it or we're afraid to purchase it in 2020, or it was, we were too busy, whether, it's adding, square footage or a location change or, a changeover, something that I can't do that right now because I'm too busy. I can't afford to do it. I can't afford the disruption of it. Whether, we're thinking about some of these awesome vendors here, from automation opportunities. It's yeah, it sounds nice in theory, but I've just got too much going on right now. I can't do that. There is a pause coming to make the proverbial lemonade out of these economic lemons. Is okay. It's a mild recession, more of a breather really than abject pain, into infinity and beyond. And say, okay, what can I do in 2024 that when I get some relief, off those valves to say, okay, what has been utterly neglected in my business or for my staff for the last 3 or 4 years because I just haven't been able to do it? We should be thinking about that next year and taking the long-term view and trying to be excited about what's coming in 2025 while acknowledging the risk and some of the caution that we have to take over the next 6 or 7 quarters.
Is now the time to start thinking and planning for that?
I think it has to be in a lot of cases. I mean, as we think about some of the lead times that we might be quoted for, if it is, an equipment investment, some manufacturers that we talk to, not necessarily in this space, but in some cases they're already booking orders for 24. So it's, if we're waiting until 2024, then it's okay, we're not getting it until 25, and then, it's, we're kind of late on the uptick. So I think at least from a planning standpoint, and for anyone listening or listens to the recording subsequently, if maybe I've bursted some bubbles, maybe re-examine what we budgeted for, what we expected, make sure, are those sober targets, are those objective targets, or is that, maybe what we landed on late last year was that maybe getting caught up in the moment of how busy we are and just assuming it's going to last forever because it kind of felt like that at the time, and maybe still does for some folks. So re-examining, making sure that we're not too over-enthusiastic for the next couple of years and thinking about how can we make the most of this, because our view at ITR is always that there is opportunity in every phase of the business cycle, and on the equipment purchase side, again, we want to buy in the bottoms of these cycles because lead times are generally going to be shorter. Pricing should generally be favorable, and just try to make the most of it. It's if we just kind of sit there and let it happen to us with no plan, it's probably not going to be a very pleasant experience. But if it's proactively managed to and toward, I don't know if it'll necessarily be pleasant, but I think it will be less unpleasant than I think it would be otherwise. So.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so. I think that we covered most of it.
We did.
So that's the playing field. That's where we're heading. And I know it's more fun to give good news, but I think it's better to be aware and prepared than blissfully unaware and just kind of fall right into it.
You got to talk about the tough times so that you're prepared for them when they get here. Great.
Sure.
Well, Connor, thank you so much for joining us for 2023 and Beyond, a view from The Economist. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.